My husband had twins with my own best friend. I quietly signed the divorce papers and handed over our luxury estate without a single tear. But when he proudly brought those babies home to his elite parents, his mother turned deathly pale and whispered, "She still has not told you the truth about yourself." Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to outsmart people who thought they broke you. The sharp scent of sterile hospital bleach and overly fragrant expensive white orchids hit me the very moment I forcefully pushed open the heavy polished mahogany door of the exclusive VIP maternity suite at Atlanta Medical Center. I did not hesitate. I walked straight over to the edge of the oversized hospital bed and dropped a neatly folded piece of paper directly onto Julian's lap. It was the $45,000 hospital bill for the delivery room completely under my name. Julian barely glanced at the paper. My husband of 7 years simply sat there casually resting his hand on the hospital blanket. Right next to him lay Naomi, my supposed absolute best friend, since our very first day of college, cradling 2 tiny newborn babies wrapped securely in identical pristine white hospital blankets. Julian slowly picked up the medical bill, let out a short, arrogant laugh, and tore the paper directly in half. He let the torn pieces flutter lazily onto the pristine, gleaming hospital floor. He looked at me with cold, calculating eyes entirely devoid of the charm that had once fooled me. "Naomi just gave me something you never could." "Chloe," he said, his voice dripping with casual cruelty. "She gave me the heirs to the Sterling family legacy. You should be thanking her instead of throwing tantrums over pocket change. The elite Sterling bloodline requires a future, and a barren woman simply cannot provide that." I watched Naomi adjust her grip on the sleeping infants. She looked up at me with a sickeningly sweet smile that did not quite reach her eyes. She gently stroked the head of the baby boy closest to her, adjusting his tiny blue knitted cap. "You know, Chloe," she murmured, her tone laced with poisonous satisfaction, "I spent the last 10 years standing quietly in your shadow. I wore your old designer dresses when you cleared out your massive closet. I attended all your glamorous charity galas strictly as your plus one. I smiled and clapped while you built your fancy crisis management firm and married the most eligible bachelor in Atlanta. But look at us now. I might have worn your hand-me-downs, but I am the one walking away with the ultimate prize." She leaned closer to Julian, pressing her cheek against his broad shoulder. "I am giving him the grand family he truly deserves. You can go back to your empty office and your incredibly empty life." I did not scream. I did not cry. My professional crisis management instincts, the exact skills that had spent years discreetly cleaning up the Sterling family financial messes, kicked in with absolute clarity. I reached gently into my designer tote bag and pulled out a thick manila folder. I set it deliberately on the rolling tray table next to the bed. "These are the divorce papers," I said, my voice dangerously steady and calm. "I have already signed them. You get the sprawling mansion in Buckhead. You get the imported luxury cars sitting in the massive driveway. You get full custody of your brand new perfect family. I want absolutely nothing from you, Julian. Just a very clean break." Julian looked genuinely surprised for a fraction of a second before his typical arrogance quickly returned. He reached for the heavy fountain pen resting on the tray. Finally realizing your proper place, he mocked, hastily scribbling his signature across the bottom line. "Smartest business decision you have made all year. The Sterlings do not do messy public divorces. You take your little public relations firm and you fade away quietly." Before I could retrieve the signed documents, the heavy suite door swung open again. The rest of the Sterling family flowed into the room, bringing a suffocating wave of elite entitlement with them. Leading the pack was Connor, my sister-in-law, Beatrice's husband. Connor was a wealthy white investment banker who had married into the prominent African-American family purely for social leverage and political connections. He thrived on acting incredibly superior, always eager to assert his dominance in a family that barely tolerated him. Connor strode right past me, aggressively slapping Julian on the shoulder with a hearty laugh. "Look at this," he boomed, his voice filling the crowded room. "Two perfectly healthy heirs for the empire." He turned his cold gaze toward me, looking me up and down with obvious disdain. "Well, look who finally decided to show up and face hard reality." He crossed his arms, standing tall as if he owned the hospital. "It is about time you packed it up, Chloe," Connor sneered loudly. "Honestly, we were all getting thoroughly exhausted watching you constantly pretend you belonged in this family. The Sterling elite circles have absolutely no room for defective failures. You were always just a desperate commoner playing dress-up. Do yourself a massive favor and disappear before we have to completely crush that little company of yours just to make a point." I slowly picked up the signed, legally binding divorce papers, carefully sliding them safely into my dark leather bag. I smoothed the front of my flawlessly tailored blazer, meeting Connor, arrogant stare with a perfectly calm smile. I deliberately did not break eye contact with him for a second as I finally spoke. "Please take excellent care of these precious heirs, Connor," I whispered softly, making sure he heard every word. "You will need them sooner than you think." I turned my back on the stifling hospital room and walked away. The heavy mahogany door clicked shut behind me, instantly silencing Connor and his arrogant laughter. I did not run. I did not rush. I walked down the sterile hospital corridor with the measured, deliberate pace of a woman who held the absolute destruction of an entire dynasty right inside her dark leather bag. My phone vibrated in my blazer pocket. It was a secure message from my lead financial analyst, asking for the green light on our contingency plan. I simply typed the word "execute" and stepped out into the warm Atlanta afternoon. The true crisis had not even begun. Across town, hidden behind the wrought iron gates of the ultra-exclusive Buckhead neighborhood, Julian was already celebrating his supposed flawless victory. He pulled his imported sports car into the circular driveway of the sprawling Du Bois family estate. The mansion was a colossal monument to generational wealth, featuring towering white pillars, manicured botanical gardens, and a legacy built on decades of ruthless social climbing. Oil portraits of wealthy Du Bois ancestors lined the grand hallway, constantly reminding everyone who entered of the heavy expectations that came with the elite name. Julian strode through the massive double doors, tossing his custom jacket to the waiting staff, without so much as a glance in their direction. He practically marched into the formal drawing room, a space lavishly decorated with priceless African-American art and antique furnishings. He was not alone for long. Connor arrived moments later, sauntering into the room with that exact same unwarranted swagger he carried everywhere. The two men moved to the polished mahogany bar, pouring themselves heavy glasses of aged bourbon to toast their mutual brilliance. Vivienne Dubois sat perfectly upright on a velvet chaise lounge near the grand fireplace. At 62 years old, my mother-in-law was the terrifying, undisputed matriarch of the family. She was a woman who valued pure bloodline, social dominance, and flawless public perception above breathing itself. She wore a tailored emerald dress, casually sipping imported tea from a delicate bone china cup, waiting for the daily report on the family empire. Julian dropped the manila folder directly onto the antique glass coffee table in front of her. He flashed a wide, triumphant smile, looking to Connor for validation, before turning back to his mother. "It is done," he announced, his voice echoing off the high ceilings. "I finally got rid of her. Maya just signed the divorce papers right there in the hospital room." She completely caved under the pressure. Connor chuckled, taking a slow sip of his drink. "I told you she would break if we backed her into a corner," he boasted. "She did not ask for a single penny. Not the house, not the cars, absolutely nothing. She is walking away completely empty-handed, exactly like the irrelevant commoner she always was. We put her right back in her place." Vivienne slowly lowered her teacup to its matching saucer. She looked at the folder, then up at her son. Her expression was unreadable, a carefully constructed mask of elite indifference. "And what about the other pressing matter?" she asked, smoothly adjusting her posture. "The gallery owner. Naomi. I assume she delivered on her end of this rather messy arrangement." Julian took a victorious gulp of his bourbon. "Naomi just delivered two perfectly healthy baby boys, twin heirs for the Du Bois family trust. Everything is completely secure. I secured the lineage, and I did it without letting Maya sink her greedy claws into a single dime of our family wealth. Now Naomi and the boys can move into the estate by the end of the month, and we can finally close the book on this embarrassing chapter of my life." Connor nodded in enthusiastic agreement. The board of directors will be thrilled. Two male heirs solidify your position perfectly. The massive family trust fund finally unlocks, the nervous shareholders stay happy, and we never have to deal with Maya or her constant crisis management lectures ever again. It was the perfect, flawless strategy. We hold all the power now. Vivienne did not smile. She did not offer a graceful word of congratulations. She did not raise a glass to toast the much-anticipated arrival of her brand-new grandsons. Instead, her perfectly manicured hands began to tremble. She stared at Julian as if he had just spoken in a terrifying, unrecognizable language. The vibrant color completely drained from her face, leaving her usually radiant skin looking like pale, cold ash. The confident, terrifying matriarch of the Dubois family suddenly looked small, fragile, and overwhelmingly panicked. She reached for her teacup again, but her hands were shaking so violently that the delicate porcelain rattled loudly against the saucer. The cup slipped from her fingers. It hit the glass coffee table and shattered into dozens of sharp, jagged pieces. Dark, hot tea spilled across the polished surface and dripped heavily onto the priceless Persian rug below. Vivian did not even blink. She did not call for the household staff to come clean up the mess. She just stared blankly at the signed divorce papers lying dangerously close to the broken porcelain. The room fell into a heavy, suffocating silence. The triumphant smiles vanished from Julian and Connor faces. Julian frowned, setting his bourbon down on the bar. "Mother, what is wrong with you? I just told you our future is completely secure. We have 2 boys. The legacy is safe." Vivian slowly looked up at her son. Her chest heaved with sudden, erratic, panicked breaths. She gripped the arms of the velvet chair, her knuckles turning bone white as she struggled to find her voice. Her eyes were wide with a sudden, suffocating terror that made the temperature in the room feel like it had plummeted. "The boy did not tell you," she whispered, her voice trembling and barely recognizable. Julian took a confused step forward. "Told me what? What are you talking about?" Vivienne swallowed hard, a look of absolute horror washing over her face, as she stared at the man claiming to be a new father. "Maya has still not told you the truth about that." Julian stared at his mother, completely baffled by her sudden physical collapse. He let out a harsh, dismissive sigh, clearly annoyed that she was ruining his moment of absolute victory. "You are being entirely too dramatic, Mother," he groaned, waving his hand in the air. "Maya has no power anymore. She signed away everything. There is no hidden truth, just a bitter ex-wife trying to cause unnecessary stress because she knows she lost. You need to calm down and prepare for the upcoming board meeting." Connor stepped over the puddle of hot tea, rolling his eyes as he aggressively patted Julian on the back. "She is just panicking over potential society gossip," Julian Connor said smoothly. "Older generations always assume the absolute worst when a divorce happens. Let her rest. We have much more important work to do right now. We need to make sure Maya is thoroughly erased from this city before the sun goes down." Julian nodded eagerly, leaving his trembling mother behind without a single second thought. The 2 men retreated to the massive, soundproofed home office at the end of the grand hallway. Connor immediately took a seat behind the heavy oak desk, cracking his knuckles like a predator preparing for a feast. It was time to completely suffocate Maya financially. Connor absolutely thrived on this specific kind of cruelty. He pulled out his phone and started utilizing his extensive network of Wall Street executives and high society board members. Within 10 demanding minutes, Connor had personally frozen every single joint credit card bearing Maya's name. He called the membership director of the elite Buckhead Country Club, aggressively demanding that her access be permanently revoked, effective immediately. He even contacted the private security firm that managed the heavily guarded gates of their neighborhood, ordering them to flag her license plate so she could never drive past the front entrance again. Julian watched this ruthless execution with pure admiration, pouring himself another tall glass of bourbon to celebrate their absolute domination over the woman they despised. Now Connor grinned wickedly, holding his phone up in the air. "Let us hear her cry. I want to hear the exact moment she realizes she has absolutely nothing left." Julian dialed Maya private number, pressing the speaker button so Connor could enjoy the impending emotional breakdown. The line rang twice before the secure connection opened. Far away from the toxic energy of the Dubois estate, Maya was sitting comfortably in a private sunlit suite at an exclusive midtown nail salon. She was perfectly relaxed, watching her personal manicurist apply a fresh coat of sharp blood-red polish to her nails. Her phone rested on the pristine marble table beside her. When she saw Julian's name flash across the screen, she did not panic. She did not hesitate. She simply tapped the green answer button and set it on speaker, maintaining her flawless, terrifying composure. "Well, well, well, Connor," loud, mocking voice blasted through the phone speaker. "Have you tried to buy a simple coffee yet, Maya? Or maybe you tried to enter the country club for a pathetic solo lunch? Oh wait, you cannot, because you do not exist in this city anymore." Julian chuckled deeply in the background. "Your black cards are declining, Maya," Julian added with vicious delight. "Your access to the estate is completely gone. You are effectively locked out of the entire empire. You walked out of that hospital room acting like an untouchable queen, but right now you are just another broke commoner stranded on the street." Maya held out her right hand quietly, inspecting the glossy finish of her manicured nails. She did not raise her voice. She did not beg for mercy. She simply let them enjoy their temporary foolish delusion. "We are willing to be generous, though," Connor interrupted, adopting a tone of incredibly fake pity. "We know you built that little crisis management business, but you and I both know it relies entirely on the powerful Dubois name for credibility. Without us backing you, you will be totally bankrupt by Friday. So here's the deal. You have exactly 24 hours to return to the estate. You will get on your knees in the grand foyer. You will sincerely apologize to Naomi for your unacceptable behavior at the hospital. If you beg convincingly enough, Julian might write you a tiny settlement check so you do not have to live out of your car." Julian laughed again, a harsh grating sound that used to make Maya's stomach turn. 24 hours, Maya. Tick-tock. Maya gently pulled her hand away from the manicurist, signaling for a moment of privacy. She picked up the phone, her face a mask of absolute terrifying calm. "Julian," she said smoothly, her voice slicing through their arrogant laughter like a sharpened razor blade. "You and Connor have always shared one fatal flaw. You constantly confuse loud arrogance with actual untouchable power." "What is that supposed to mean?" Julian snapped, his amusement instantly vanishing. "It means you really should have checked who actually built the infrastructure of your wealth before you tried to confidently lock the doors," Maya replied effortlessly. Maya pressed a silver button on her smartwatch, connecting a direct encrypted radio line to Zara. Zara was her fiercely loyal chief financial officer, currently sitting in the high-tech control room of their elite crisis management firm. Zara had been monitoring the Dubois accounts for 5 solid years, silently managing the massive offshore funds that kept the family incredibly rich and entirely free from federal tax scrutiny. "Zara," Maya said into the watch, her tone completely devoid of hesitation. "Connor and Julian believe they control the board today. It is time to educate them. Freeze the Cayman Island black funds immediately. Shut down every single shell corporation operating under the Dubois holding umbrella. Cut their corporate liquidity to absolute zero." "Understood, boss." Zara. Confident voice crackled back through the speaker. "Executing total financial lockdown protocol right now." In the lavish home office of the Dubois mansion, the heavy silence was suddenly shattered by the aggressive high-pitched chiming of Julian's private financial tablet. Connor's personal cell phone began vibrating wildly against the oak desk. They both looked down, their eyes widening in sudden, unadulterated panic. Massive red alert banners flooded their glowing screens. The primary offshore accounts, containing over $50 million in liquid cash, were suddenly flagged as restricted. Passwords had been violently altered. Digital keys were completely revoked. "What did you just do?" Julian screamed into the phone, the heavy glass of expensive bourbon slipping from his sweating hand and crashing violently onto the hardwood floor. "Maya, what the hell did you just do to my accounts?" "I just showed you the massive difference between a man who inherits an empire and a woman who actually runs it," Maya stated calmly, admiring her perfect red nails in the sunlight. You wanted to cut off my coffee money, Julian. I just cut off your oxygen. The rules of engagement have officially changed, and I am the only one holding the keys. She ended the call instantly, slicing off Julian, frantic, panicked, shouting. The salon suite was perfectly quiet once again. Maya took a deep, refreshing breath, truly relishing the glorious sensation of total control. Their pathetic financial ambush had failed spectacularly, and she was just getting started. Maya stepped out of the luxury salon, the heavy glass door swinging shut behind her. The humid Atlanta air hit her face, but she felt absolutely invigorated. Her matte black SUV was already waiting at the curb. She slid into the plush leather back seat and immediately opened her secure laptop. The screen illuminated her face, displaying a dizzying cascade of financial networks, shell companies, and offshore holdings, all of them currently flashing a bright, satisfying crimson red. Zara's voice came through the secure vehicle audio system. We have complete lockdown, Maya. The board of directors is completely blind. Julian corporate access is entirely terminated. They are effectively paralyzed. Maya typed a complex command into her terminal, locking out the secondary Swiss accounts just for good measure. They actually thought my crisis management firm was just a cute public relations hobby, she said, shaking her head at the sheer audacity of her former husband. They genuinely convinced themselves that I just wrote polite apology letters to the press when they made inappropriate remarks at charity galas. The truth was far darker and much more lucrative. 5 years ago, Julian Arrogance had nearly destroyed the entire Du Bois real estate empire. He had carelessly funneled millions of dollars through an illegal offshore gambling syndicate, drawing the direct aggressive attention of federal tax investigators. The family was exactly 2 weeks away from a massive federal indictment that would have resulted in Julian spending decades in a federal penitentiary. The elite Du Bois name would have been permanently dragged through the mud. Vivian had been practically hyperventilating in her drawing room, terrified of losing her precious high society status. It was Maya who stepped in and took absolute control. She did not just write a press release. She built a ghost network. She founded her crisis management firm as a brilliant, impenetrable shield. Maya personally restructured their entire financial web, created legitimate corporate entities to absorb the toxic assets, and paid off the right lobbyists to make the federal investigation quietly disappear. She saved Julian's life. She saved Vivian's prestigious reputation. She built the exact financial fortress that currently housed their immense wealth. And because she built the fortress, she inherently held the only master keys to the gates. She was never a parasite feeding off their generational wealth. She was the vital heartbeat keeping the rotting corpse of their empire alive. Back at the sprawling Buckhead estate, the atmosphere had deteriorated into pure, unadulterated chaos. Julian was frantically pacing behind his heavy oak desk, his expensive cashmere sweater now stained with dark patches of nervous sweat. He was screaming into his phone at his senior information technology director. "What do you mean you cannot bypass her firewall?" Julian roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. "You are paid $500,000 a year to manage our security. Break into the system and give me my money back." The director's voice trembled through the phone. Sir Maya did not just change the passwords. She engineered the entire routing system using military-grade encryption. She is the legal sole proprietor of the holding company that manages the Cayman funds. Technically, by federal law, she is not stealing your money. She is just securing her own corporate assets. If we try to hack it, we will trigger an automatic alert to the Internal Revenue Service. Julian hurled his phone across the room. It smashed against a priceless oil painting, cracking the canvas. Connor stood near the window, aggressively tapping his own phone. His usual cocky swagger had completely evaporated. Connor had promised his own ruthless investors a massive return based on the Du Bois capital. If Julian was broke, Connor was effectively dead in the water. "This makes absolutely no sense," Connor muttered, frantically scrolling through his dead accounts. "She is just a woman from the South Side. How did she gain this level of executive control without our lawyers flagging it?" "Because you never bothered to read the actual paperwork you signed 5 years ago," Julian snapped viciously, realizing his own fatal stupidity. You and my mother just assumed she was handling basic accounting. You let her build the entire offshore infrastructure because you were too lazy to do it yourselves. Julian ran a shaking hand over his face. The reality of his situation was crashing down on him like a concrete wall. He had a mistress resting in an exorbitant VIP maternity suite that cost thousands of dollars a day. He had an entire household staff expecting their weekly paychecks by tomorrow morning. He had aggressive real estate contractors waiting for their scheduled wire transfers. And he currently had zero access to a single penny of his own $50 million liquid fortune. "I need physical cash!" Julian demanded, his eyes darting around the room wildly. "I need untraceable cash right now to pay off the private bankers before they freeze my local operating accounts. I have an emergency platinum card tied to a separate private vault in Midtown." She cannot possibly know about that one. Julian stormed out of the office, completely ignoring his mother, who was still weeping softly on the velvet chaise lounge in the hallway. He jumped into his imported sports car, the tires screeching loudly as he sped down the long driveway and tore through the heavy iron gates of his neighborhood. He drove recklessly toward the high-end private banking sector of the city, his heart pounding with sheer desperation. He pulled up to an exclusive, secure automated teller machine reserved strictly for ultra-high net worth clients. The street was busy with wealthy afternoon shoppers and business executives. Julian stepped out of his car, adjusting his collar to maintain his facade of elite wealth. He slid his heavy titanium emergency card into the machine, swiftly punching in his private identification number. He confidently selected a withdrawal amount of $10,000. The machine processed the request. The screen loaded. Then a harsh red message flashed across the digital display. "Transaction denied. Account frozen. Please contact your administrator." Julian gritted his teeth, his face burning with sudden humiliation, as a well-dressed woman behind him in line let out an annoyed sigh. He angrily shoved the card back into the slot, punching the buttons with aggressive force. He lowered the amount to $5,000. Denied. He tried $1,000. Denied. He tried $500. Denied. He tried $100. The machine beeped a loud, rejecting tone. Denied. He slammed his fist against the heavy metal machine, drawing shocked stares from the affluent pedestrians walking past him on the sunlit sidewalk. The powerful heir to the Du Bois real estate dynasty, the man who had just viciously mocked his wife for being a penniless commoner, was now standing on a public street, completely unable to withdraw a single dollar to buy a bottle of water. His phone vibrated violently in his pocket. He yanked it out, his breathing heavy and ragged. A single text message glowed brightly on the screen. The sender was Maya. He opened the message, his hands shaking as his eyes scanned the brief, terrifying sentence that solidified his absolute downfall. "The rules of the game just changed." My crisis management firm occupied the entire 50th floor. I sat calmly behind my custom black marble desk, taking a slow sip of sparkling water. The satisfying silence was interrupted violently. The heavy frosted glass doors to my private suite burst open with explosive force. Connor and Vivienne aggressively shoved past my receptionist. They marched into my sanctuary like entitled conquerors, bringing the suffocating toxic energy of the Du Bois estate directly into my professional domain. Vivienne was practically vibrating with aristocratic rage. She gripped her designer handbag so tightly her knuckles were stark white. Connor stormed ahead of her, his face twisted into an ugly, threatening snarl that completely erased his usual polished investment banker persona. He marched straight up to my marble desk and slammed both of his hands down onto the smooth surface, making my crystal water glass rattle sharply. "You have exactly 3 minutes to reverse whatever pathetic digital stunt you just pulled," Connor demanded, his voice echoing loudly off the glass walls. He leaned heavily over my desk, trying to use his tall, imposing physical presence to intimidate me. "You think you can just press a button and hold our entire corporate structure hostage? You are completely delusional, Maya. You are playing a high-stakes game with people who own the board." Vivienne stepped up beside him, her perfectly painted lips curled into a vicious sneer of absolute disgust. "You have always been nothing but a street-level hustler wearing expensive clothes. she spat, her voice dripping with pure elitist venom. My son elevated you. He picked you up from the dirt and allowed you to sit at tables you never could have reached on your own. You will never possess the refined breeding, the inherent class, or the pure legacy of a true Dubois. You are just a bitter, barren woman throwing a childish temper tantrum because Julian finally found a woman capable of fulfilling her basic biological duties. I did not flinch at her cruel words. I did not raise my voice. I simply leaned back in my ergonomic leather chair and folded my hands neatly in my lap. I watched them unravel. Connor took my silence for weakness. He pointed a shaking, aggressive finger directly at my face. Listen to me very carefully, he growled, dropping his voice into a low, menacing threat. I have 3 different cutthroat legal teams from Wall Street on speed dial right now. I know exactly how to manipulate the justice system. I will personally ensure that you are indicted for corporate espionage, grand larceny, and federal wire fraud before the week is over. I will spin this entire narrative to the press. I will paint you as the deranged, jealous, infertile ex-wife who tried to bankrupt a prominent African-American family out of pure spite. My connections will have you locked inside a federal penitentiary for the next 20 years. You will lose this firm. You will lose your freedom. You will lose absolutely everything. Connor smiled, then a sickeningly confident smirk that highlighted his supreme arrogance. He genuinely believed that his white privilege and his aggressive corporate connections made him completely untouchable in this room. You always talk entirely too much, Connor, I said smoothly, my voice cutting through his arrogant monologue like a blade. You married into Beatrice's family because your own hedge fund was quietly failing, and you desperately needed the pristine Dubois name to secure new wealthy investors. You used their black excellence as a shield for your own terrifying mediocrity. Vivian gasped loudly at my sheer audacity, clutching her chest. How dare you speak to him that way? She screeched. Connor is a highly respected financial genius who has multiplied our assets. He is the very pillar of this family. Connor puffed out his chest, looking incredibly smug. You cannot intimidate me with petty insults, Maya. Reverse the bank freeze immediately, or my lawyers will destroy you by tomorrow morning. I slowly opened the top drawer of my marble desk. I did not pull out a legal defense. I did not pull out a reversal code for the Cayman accounts. I pulled out a thick-bound red folder. I tossed it casually across the smooth desk. It slid perfectly across the marble and stopped right until it hit Connor's tense, white-knuckled hands. I highly suggest you instruct your aggressive Wall Street lawyers to review page 4 of that specific document, I instructed calmly. Connor frowned deeply, his arrogant smirk faltering slightly as he grabbed the red folder and flipped it open. Vivian peered over his shoulder, her eyes narrowing in confusion. Connor's eyes rapidly scanned the top page. I watched the exact second his heart stopped. I watched the confident, threatening color drain completely from his face, leaving him looking like a terrified ghost. His breathing hitched sharply in his throat. His hands began to shake so violently that the papers rustled loudly in the quiet office. What is this? Vivian demanded, looking at her son-in-law sudden terror. Maya, what fake documents are you trying to peddle now? It is the comprehensive financial routing history for Naomi High-End Art Gallery, I announced, watching Connor's soul practically leave his body. The same beautiful art gallery I generously funded for my best friend. But strangely, I noticed a series of massive, untraceable cash deposits flowing through the gallery accounts every single month. Millions of dollars in fake art sales, and all of that dirty money traces directly back to your failing hedge fund, Connor. I leaned forward, resting my arms on the desk, locking my eyes onto his terrified, pale face. Naomi Art Gallery is not a business. It is a massive money laundering front, and you are the one running it. Connor staggered backward, his expensive leather shoes scraping awkwardly against the polished marble floor of my office. All his aggressive white privilege swagger had evaporated the exact second he realized I held the undeniable proof of his federal crimes. Vivian stood frozen, her mouth opening and closing, as she stared at the financial documents proving her precious son-in-law was a common criminal laundering money through Naomi Art Gallery. I did not give them a single chance to formulate a pathetic defense or beg for my silence. I simply pressed the intercom button on my desk and calmly instructed my private security team to immediately escort them out of the building. They left in complete silence, deeply terrified of the catastrophic damage I could effortlessly inflict with a single phone call to the local authorities. Despite the absolute financial bloodbath currently occurring behind their closed doors, the arrogant Du Bois family refused to cancel their highly publicized society event. That Friday evening, they hosted their extravagant air announcement gala at the Onyx Club, the most prestigious invite-only country club for the African American elite in Atlanta. The massive event was a desperate, highly calculated public relations maneuver. Julian and Connor needed to project an image of absolute stability and generational prosperity to reassure their nervous Wall Street investors. They needed to parade Naomi and the newborn twins in front of the city's wealthiest socialites to prove that the Du Bois legacy was entirely secure and expanding rapidly. The grand ballroom of the Onyx Club was flawlessly decorated with cascading white roses and towering crystal centerpieces. A live jazz band played softly in the corner, while waiters in crisp white tuxedos circulated with silver trays of imported champagne. Julian stood near the grand sweeping staircase, sweating profusely inside his custom-tailored tuxedo. He was forcing bright, entirely fake smiles as he shook hands with powerful local politicians and wealthy real estate tycoons. He was desperately playing the role of the triumphant new father, even though he knew perfectly well that his offshore accounts were completely frozen and his credit cards were declining across the city. He was putting on a theatrical performance to hide the terrifying fact that his empire was currently suffocating inside my digital vault. Naomi was thoroughly enjoying her stolen moment of glory. She stood proudly next to Julian, wearing a lavish crimson gown that practically screamed new money and desperation. She was holding court among the elite wives of Atlanta, soaking in their polite congratulations and masking her deep insecurities behind a loud, practiced laugh. Around her neck rested the undisputed crown jewel of the evening. She was wearing the legendary Du Bois family diamond necklace, a breathtaking heirloom piece that Vivian had aggressively guarded for decades. Giving that specific necklace to Naomi was Vivian's ultimate statement to the high society crowd. It was a loud public declaration that Naomi was the official accepted mother of the new heirs. Naomi touched the heavy diamonds constantly, making absolutely sure that every single guest in the crowded ballroom noticed her elevated status. She genuinely believed she had finally secured her permanent place at the very top of the social ladder. She had absolutely no idea that the wealthy family she just married into was currently bleeding out financially. She was completely oblivious to the fact that her beloved art gallery was about to be raided by federal investigators because of Connor's illegal laundering operation. She just smiled brightly, entirely, convinced that she had completely defeated me. That was the exact moment I arrived to shatter their perfect illusion. I did not sneak into the venue through a side door or hide from the cameras. I pulled my sleek vehicle directly up to the main entrance and handed the keys to the stunned valet. I stepped into the grand ballroom of the Onyx Club, wearing a breathtaking floor-length emerald silk gown that hugged every curve perfectly. The rich, vibrant color highlighted my skin and radiated pure, untouchable power. I did not look like a defeated, discarded ex-wife mourning the tragic loss of her marriage. I looked like a fierce woman who owned the entire building and everyone inside it. My entrance was not quiet. The heavy brass doors swung open and the sudden shift in the atmosphere was immediate. The polite chatter near the entrance abruptly died down. Heads began to turn one by one. The whispers spread through the opulent ballroom like a rapid wildfire as the wealthy guests recognized me. They parted seamlessly, creating a clear, wide path for me as I walked confidently across the room. I kept my posture impeccably straight, and my chin held high, letting the soft light from the crystal chandeliers catch the simple, elegant gold chain around my neck. I did not need massive, gaudy family diamonds to prove my immense worth. My sheer presence commanded the complete, undivided attention of every single person in that room. Julian saw me from across the ballroom, and the fake smile instantly vanished from his sweating face. His eyes widened in absolute panic. He instinctively took a step backward, terrified that I was about to announce his financial ruin to his wealthy investors. Connor was standing near the open bar, and he actually dropped his cocktail napkin when he spotted me, his face turning a sickly shade of gray, as he remembered the money laundering evidence sitting safely on my desk. But Naomi did not share their silent terror. Fueled by her misplaced arrogance and the heavy, intoxicating weight of the Dubois diamonds resting against her collarbone, she saw my sudden arrival as a direct challenge to her new authority. She handed her champagne glass to a passing waiter and straightened her shoulders. She wanted to prove to the entire room that she was the new queen of the dynasty, and that I was just an irrelevant ghost from Julian past. Naomi strode forward, firmly blocking my path with a triumphant, highly provocative smile. Naomi stood mere inches from me, the heavy Dubois family diamonds glittering wildly against her collarbone under the massive crystal chandeliers. She raised her chin desperately, trying to look down at me despite my stiletto heels, putting me a full head taller than her. She let out a sharp, highly theatrical laugh, specifically designed to carry across the entirely silent ballroom. The surrounding crowd of elite politicians, wealthy real estate developers, and prominent socialites leaned in much closer, incredibly eager for the impending scandal. Naomi clearly thought this was her ultimate crowning moment. She believed she had finally trapped me in a corner where I could not fight back without ruining my professional reputation. She intentionally stepped on the hem of my emerald gown with her sharp heel. "What exactly are you doing here today, Maya?" Naomi asked, her voice deliberately projected, so the entire front row of high-profile VIP guests could hear every single cruel word. I am absolutely positive we did not include the bitter rejected ex-wife on the exclusive guest list. This gala is a highly restricted celebration of the new powerful Dubois generation. It is a private party strictly for real family members, and for important people who can actually contribute to the long-lasting legacy of this dynasty. She placed an exaggerated protective hand over her flat stomach, drawing everyone's attention to her new status as a mother. "We are all here tonight celebrating the beautiful twin boys I just brought into this world. I know it must be incredibly difficult and deeply painful for you to stand there and witness a real woman flawlessly doing the one simple biological task you completely failed at." Loud gasps rippled swiftly through the wealthy crowd. People exchanged deeply shocked whispers, their judgmental eyes darting frantically between my flawless emerald dress and Naomi's gaudy crimson gown. Naomi smiled even wider greedily, drinking in the toxic attention like a parched woman in a desert. "You are barren, Maya," she declared, making sure the word echoed loudly off the high ceilings. Julian desperately needed a fertile mother for his prestigious heirs, not a defective, broken workaholic who spends all her miserable time hiding in a corporate office because her own body is totally useless. You could never give this powerful family what they truly needed, so you need to accept your pathetic reality and leave right now. Before I could even attempt to respond to her pathetic, vile monologue, Beatrice violently pushed her way through the dense crowd of onlookers. Julian's wealthy sister was wearing a silver sequined dress that looked entirely too tight, and she was glaring at me with absolute unfiltered contempt. Connor was right behind his wife, his pale face flushed heavily with the temporary liquid courage provided by the expensive open bar. Beatrice crossed her arms, standing shoulder to shoulder with Naomi, to proudly present a unified aggressive front of highly privileged mean girls. "You heard her perfectly clearly," Maya Beatrice snapped, aggressively pointing a manicured finger directly toward the heavy brass exit doors at the back of the room. "You are making a massive embarrassing fool of yourself just by breathing the exact same air as us tonight. My brother finally upgraded his life by choosing a woman who can actually produce healthy elite children for our bloodline," Beatrice continued loudly, her voice dripping with sheer aristocratic venom. You are nothing but a discarded failure, and your very presence in this room is completely ruining the perfect aesthetic of our beautiful family celebration. Have you zero shame or dignity left in your body? Connor aggressively stepped forward, then deeply eager to assert his white savior dominance over the entire chaotic situation. He frantically waved his hand high in the air, frantically signaling the head of the country club elite security detail. Security Connor barked loudly, adopting his most authoritative, commanding tone. Remove this disruptive woman from the premises immediately. She is illegally trespassing on a private, highly secure corporate event. I want her physically escorted out the back service door right this second, so she does not upset the high-value investors any further. I slowly glanced over Connor Tent's shoulder and locked eyes directly with Julian. My ex-husband was standing comfortably near the grand sweeping staircase, casually swirling a glass of imported champagne. He did not take a single step forward to stop his brand-new mistress, his cruel sister, or his arrogant brother-in-law from publicly degrading me in front of the entire city. Instead, Julian simply smirked. He raised his crystal glass slightly in my direction, looking profoundly triumphant and deeply satisfied. He genuinely believed that watching me get forcefully thrown out into the street by the bouncers would somehow magically restore his shattered ego and fix his current financial ruin. 4 security guards in dark suits quickly approached our tense circle. Naomi confidently crossed her arms, her stolen diamond necklace catching the bright light as she eagerly prepared to watch my ultimate humiliating exit. Beatrice quickly pulled out her expensive smartphone, getting ready to record my sheer embarrassment for her exclusive social media circle to mock later. But I did not break a single sweat. I did not flinch or look away. I simply stood my ground, maintaining my flawless, terrifying posture, completely unbothered by their desperate, pathetic performance. The head of security finally reached our hostile group, but he did not look at me. He did not reach for my arm to escort me out of the building. Instead, the massive guard took a sudden sharp step backward. He and his entire team completely cleared the way, forming a wide, respectful path. The heavy brass doors of the opulent ballroom swung open once again with terrifying explosive force. A massive armed squad of Federal Economic Police agents in dark tactical windbreakers marched directly into the luxurious gala, their silver badges gleaming brightly against their dark uniforms. The live jazz band immediately stopped playing. The sudden deafening silence in the grand ballroom was pierced only by the heavy, synchronized footsteps of the federal agents marching across the polished marble floor. Connor let out a loud, victorious laugh, entirely misreading the terrifying situation unfolding right in front of his eyes. He genuinely believed his white privilege had magically summoned the authorities to remove me from his presence. He aggressively pointed his finger directly at my face, looking at the lead federal agent with a deeply arrogant smirk. "Officers, it is about time you arrived," Connor announced, his voice dripping with absolute entitlement. "This woman is completely unhinged and trespassing on a highly secure corporate event. She has been harassing my family and causing a massive scene. I want her arrested and removed from the country club immediately." Julian crossed his arms, standing next to Naomi, looking incredibly pleased with himself. He actually took a sip of his imported champagne, eagerly waiting for the armed agents to place me in heavy handcuffs. Naomi smiled brightly, touching her stolen diamond necklace, entirely ready to watch my ultimate downfall. The lead agent, a tall, imposing man with a remarkably stern face, did not even look in my direction. He walked straight past me, completely ignoring Connor demanding finger and loud complaints. The entire squad of federal agents bypassed me seamlessly, marching directly toward Julian and Connor with intense purpose. The smug, triumphant smiles instantly vanished from their sweating faces. The wealthy crowd of Atlanta elite socialites collectively gasped, taking several swift steps backward to physically distance themselves from the impending disaster. Connor dropped his arm, his pale face suddenly draining of all remaining color. "Excuse me," Connor stammered, his confident, loud voice cracking slightly under the sudden pressure. "What exactly are you doing? I am the one who called security." The lead agent stopped mere inches from Julian and Connor dominating their personal space. He pulled a thick stack of official court-stamped documents from his dark tactical windbreaker. Julian Dubois, the agent stated, his voice booming powerfully across the entirely silent ballroom. We are here executing a federal asset seizure warrant issued by the Supreme Court. Your corporate holdings, your offshore liquidity, and your physical properties are currently under direct federal lockdown due to massive unrecoverable defaulted debt obligations. Julian dropped his crystal champagne glass. It shattered violently against the marble floor, splashing expensive wine across his polished leather shoes. He stared at the federal agent in pure, unadulterated horror, unable to comprehend the words. This has to be a massive mistake. Julian choked out, his chest heaving with sudden suffocating panic. My family owns a billion-dollar real estate empire. We do not have defaulted debt. We have massive liquid assets spanning the globe. You had liquid assets, Julian, I corrected smoothly, my voice echoing clearly through the massive, opulent ballroom. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, my emerald silk gown flowing elegantly behind me. I commanded the absolute attention of every single politician, wealthy investor, and prominent socialite in the room. You had a generational empire right up until the exact second you arrogantly signed those divorce papers in the hospital room. Julian whipped his head toward me, his eyes wide with absolute primal terror. What are you talking about? He demanded, his voice shaking violently as he pointed at me. I read those papers thoroughly before I signed them. They were standard divorce documents drafted by a standard legal team. You walked away with absolutely nothing. I made perfectly sure of it. I offered you a very clean break, Julian, I replied, my tone dangerously calm and perfectly measured to convey my total control over his entire existence. I told you that you could keep the sprawling mansion in Buckhead. I told you that you could keep the imported luxury cars sitting in the driveway. I told you to keep your brand new, perfect family and leave me entirely alone. But you clearly forgot the most important fundamental rule of the elite crisis management industry. We never ever leave a single loose end untied. I opened my designer clutch and pulled out a certified, notarized copy of the exact document he had hastily scribbled his signature on just a few days ago. I held it up high for the entire room of investors to see clearly. You were so incredibly eager to get rid of your supposedly barren wife and parade your new mistress around town that you did not bother to read the fine print, I announced, making sure my voice reached the very back row of the stunned audience. You did not just sign a standard divorce decree, Julian. You signed a comprehensive transfer of authority and a full asset collateralization agreement drafted by my personal financial lawyers. Julian swayed on his feet, looking like he might actually vomit right there on the expensive ballroom floor. Beatrice covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes wide with sheer unadulterated panic as she finally realized the trap. When you signed this legally binding document, I explained flawlessly, taking another step closer to his trembling form, you officially authorized my crisis management firm to consolidate every single toxic underwater debt your family has been secretly hiding for the past decade. I took full legal ownership of your massive financial liabilities, transferring them completely into my own holding company. And then, because I inherently held the master keys to your offshore accounts and had just frozen your cash flow, I immediately called in the loans. The silence in the ballroom was absolutely suffocating, heavier than a thick wool blanket. The wealthiest, most influential people in Atlanta were silently watching the terrifying real-time destruction of the supposedly untouchable Du Bois dynasty. You owe my private firm exactly $15 million, Julian. I stated, my voice sharp and entirely unforgiving. And because you currently have zero access to your frozen offshore funds to pay me back, you are officially in total financial default. My bank immediately authorized a complete asset seizure to cover your massive outstanding debt to my company. Naomi let out a loud, hysterical gasp that echoed terribly in the quiet space. She aggressively grabbed Julian's arm violently, shaking him back and forth. Julian, do something right now, she screeched, her carefully crafted high society persona completely crumbling into desperate pieces before our very eyes. Tell them she is blatantly lying to everyone here. Tell them we still have the money locked away somewhere safe. We have the twin boys. We are the true heirs to the empire. Julian could not speak a single word. He could barely pull air into his lungs. He was completely paralyzed by the sheer crushing magnitude of his own fatal stupidity and arrogant pride. I turned my cold, unwavering gaze directly onto Naomi. She was visibly trembling, clutching the heavy Dubois family diamond necklace tightly against her chest as if trying to physically protect it from my wrath. That beautiful, sprawling mansion in Buckhead that you were so incredibly eager to move your new family into, I said, taking one final powerful step toward her shrinking figure. The expensive estate where you actively plan to replace me and live out your luxurious stolen fairy tale for the rest of your life. It no longer belongs to the Dubois family, and it certainly does not belong to you. As the primary creditor holding your defaulted debt, the bank just legally transferred the deed directly into my personal name. Naomi's jaw dropped open in pure, unadulterated shock. Tears of sudden, overwhelming defeat welled up rapidly in her dark eyes as the guests watched her fall. The house you planned to share with Naomi now belongs entirely to me, I declared coldly, my voice completely devoid of any mercy or hesitation. I invite you both to pack your designer bags and move out into the cold street tonight. The heavy silence in the grand ballroom broke as Connor aggressively pushed his way to the center of the confrontation. He adjusted his expensive silk tie and positioned himself directly in front of Julian and Naomi. Connor always loved playing the ultimate white savior for the prominent African-American family he had married into. He thrived on the deeply misguided belief that his mere presence brought legitimacy to the Dubois empire. Tonight was his perfect opportunity to play the grand hero in front of Atlanta's wealthiest socialites and prominent investors. Connor let out a loud and incredibly condescending laugh. He shook his head at me as if I were simply a confused child throwing a tantrum in a toy store. "You really thought you had us completely cornered, Maya," he announced. His booming voice was specifically calibrated to reassure the nervous politicians and real estate tycoons watching our every move. "You honestly believed that your little accounting trick was going to bring down a dynasty that has stood for over a century. It is genuinely pathetic watching you try so hard to destroy the man who simply did not want you anymore." I stood perfectly still and allowed him to dig his own grave. Connor turned slightly to address the massive crowd, spreading his arms wide in a gesture of total supreme confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen, please excuse this interruption," Connor declared. "My former sister-in-law is clearly suffering from a severe mental breakdown. She is just a deeply jealous, incredibly bitter woman who simply cannot handle the fact that my brother-in-law has finally found true happiness and secured his family bloodline. She is trying to use a minor financial technicality to create a public spectacle out of pure, unadulterated spite." Beatrice stepped up right beside her husband. She looked at Connor with absolute adoration, entirely convinced that her brilliant Wall Street husband was about to magically solve their massive family crisis. Connor wrapped a reassuring arm around Beatrice's waist and smiled warmly at a group of highly influential bank executives standing near the jazz stage. "There is absolutely no need for any panic or concern regarding the Dubois corporate holdings," Connor assured the wealthy crowd. "As the managing director of Kensington Capital Partners, I am officially stepping in to resolve this minor inconvenience. My hedge fund manages billions in liquid assets. $15 million is absolute pocket change to me. I will personally write a certified check to Maya Holding Company tonight and clear this pathetic fabricated debt. The Dubois estate remains completely secure under my financial protection." Julian let out a massive, shuddering breath of relief. Naomi smiled brightly again, her arrogant posture returning instantly. She actually reached up to adjust the heavy diamond necklace, clearly believing she had just been rescued by her powerful brother-in-law. I looked at Connor. I looked at his smug, victorious smile. I looked at his perfectly tailored tuxedo and his absolute unwavering confidence in his own manufactured superiority. And then I laughed. It was not a polite, restrained chuckle. It was a loud, sharp, genuinely amused laugh that cut through the tense ballroom like a crack of thunder. The sound echoed off the crystal chandeliers and the high vaulted ceilings. The wealthy guests exchanged highly confused, deeply nervous glances. Connor's arrogant smile faltered slightly as my laughter continued to fill the silent room. "What exactly is so funny, Maya?" Connor snapped his tone, losing its smooth professional edge. "I just offered to pay you your extortion money. You should be down on your knees thanking me for treating you with such incredible financial generosity." I slowly stopped laughing and looked directly into his pale, suddenly nervous eyes. "Connor," I said, my voice dripping with absolute unfiltered pity. "You cannot even afford to buy a stale sandwich from a vending machine tonight, let alone write a $15 million check to save your brother-in-law." I opened my designer clutch for the second time. I reached inside and pulled out a single, perfectly crisp sheet of financial paper. I held it up between my fingers, letting the bright ballroom lights illuminate the heavily redacted bank logo at the top of the page. "Your massive hedge fund is completely empty, Connor," I announced clearly, ensuring every single prominent investor in the room heard the exact words. "You do not manage billions in liquid assets. You do not manage millions." As of yesterday afternoon, Kensington Capital Partners has a grand total of $42.16 in its primary operating account. Connor's pale face instantly drained of all color. He dropped his arm from Beatrice's waist, as if he had been physically struck by lightning. "That is a blatant, malicious lie," he shouted, his voice cracking violently. "My investors trust me implicitly. My funds are locked in high-yield secure offshore bonds." "They were locked in high-yield bonds," I corrected smoothly, taking a slow, deliberate step toward him. "But you withdrew every single cent of that capital over the past 6 months. You completely liquidated your clients' investment portfolios without their knowledge or consent. You bypassed all the federal regulatory protocols and funneled that massive mountain of cash directly into a private, untraceable shell corporation." Beatrice turned to look at her husband. Her eyes were wide with sudden, terrifying confusion. "Connor, what is she talking about?" Beatrice asked, her voice trembling slightly. "Tell them she is lying. Tell them our money is perfectly safe." Connor could not look at his wife. He was staring at the paper in my hand, his breathing becoming rapid and shallow. "He cannot tell you that, Beatrice," I said, my voice completely devoid of any mercy. "Because he did not just lose the money in a bad trade. He intentionally stole it to purchase a $30 million secret penthouse in downtown Atlanta." Beatrice staggered backward, completely stunned and entirely speechless. Naomi clutched the sleeping infants tighter against her chest, her eyes darting wildly around the dead-silent ballroom. The devastating reality of her complete financial ruin was rapidly setting in, but her sheer greed simply refused to let her surrender. She stepped into the wealthy crowd, holding the newborn boys up like a physical shield against her impending eviction. She raised her voice, adopting a shrill, hysterical tone specifically designed to manipulate the elite audience. "It does not matter what financial tricks you play today, Maya," Naomi screamed, her voice echoing off the vaulted ceilings. "Julian and I still hold the ultimate power. These two beautiful baby boys are the undeniable biological heirs to the Dubois dynasty. The massive generational trust fund is worth billions of dollars, and it officially unlocks the exact moment these male heirs are legally recognized. You can steal our house, but you can never, ever take our rightful place at the absolute top of this empire." Vivienne Dubois stood frozen on the grand stage, just a few feet behind Naomi. The terrified matriarch slowly reached out with trembling hands and grabbed the heavy silver microphone from its polished stand. Vivienne knew she had to publicly validate Naomi's desperate claims. But as Vivienne lifted the microphone, her eyes locked onto my face. She saw the terrifying calm radiating from my posture. She saw the predatory amusement dancing in my eyes. Vivienne's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She was entirely paralyzed by a sudden, suffocating wave of pure panic. She knew deep in her aristocratic bones that I was not finished dismantling her entire world. I did not argue with Naomi's frantic, screaming declarations. I simply raised my hands and began to clap. The sound of my slow, deliberate, mocking applause cut through the heavy tension in the grand ballroom like a sharp whip. Clap, clap, clap. The rhythmic, echoing noise forced every single prominent politician, wealthy investor, and elite socialite to turn their complete attention back to me. Julian wiped a bead of nervous sweat from his forehead, instinctively taking a hesitant step away from Naomi and the crying babies. Connor remained glued to the floor nearby, completely shell-shocked by the brutal exposure of his own financial fraud. That was a truly spectacular, incredibly passionate speech regarding the sacred purity of the Dubois bloodline. Naomi, I announced smoothly, my voice projecting effortlessly across the vast, luxurious space. You have certainly done your tedious homework regarding the strict stipulations of the family trust fund. It is an absolutely flawless, foolproof plan to secure billions of dollars in generational wealth. There is just one tiny, microscopic biological detail that you conveniently overlooked during your calculated attempt to trap my husband. I reached into my clutch and pulled out a small remote control. I held it up high in the air, ensuring Julian, Connor, Naomi, and Vivian all saw it clearly. I pressed the single silver button right in the center. Behind Vivian, the massive digital LED screen suddenly flickered. The imposing gold crest of the Dubois family, the ultimate symbol of their aristocratic pride, instantly vanished into total darkness. The shift in lighting caused the wealthy audience to gasp and step closer to the stage, their eyes glued to the giant black screen. Vivian spun around, dropping the microphone. It hit the stage floor with a loud, piercing screech of audio feedback. She stared up at the dark screen, her breathing becoming rapid. She knew exactly what I was about to do, and she was completely powerless to stop it. The giant screen flashed brightly, illuminating the entire ballroom in a stark, harsh white light. A scanned, highly classified medical document materialized on the digital display. It was a rigorously authenticated pediatric surgical report from exactly 22 years ago. The official letterhead belonged to one of the most exclusive private medical facilities in Atlanta. The high society guests began to squint, reading the giant black text projected across the room. Whispers of sheer confusion rippled through the crowd as they tried to comprehend why a 2-decade-old medical file was being broadcast. Julian frowned deeply, stepping closer to the stage to read the glowing words. His arrogant, confident posture began to slip as he recognized the name of the private clinic. It was the exact same facility he had stayed in for several weeks when he was just a young teenager. Let us take a very close, highly educational look at this fascinating piece of family history, I instructed the captivated audience, my voice ringing with total authority. This is a highly secured, strictly confidential surgical record authorized personally by Vivian Dubois. It details an incredibly severe, highly complicated medical procedure. Julian's face slowly drained of all color. He looked away from the giant screen and turned to stare at his mother. Vivienne was violently shaking, covering her mouth with both hands as tears of absolute shame streamed down her powdered cheeks. She had spent over 2 decades burying this specific secret, paying off doctors and destroying medical records just to protect her precious son, fragile masculinity, and the family pristine image. I gestured gracefully toward the massive screen behind the sobbing matriarch. As you can clearly read on the third line, the primary patient registered on this specific surgical file is Julian Dubois. I declared, watching my ex-husband's entire universe shatter into a million irreparable pieces. And if you direct your attention to the final post-operative prognosis highlighted at the very bottom of the page, you will discover the exact reason why Naomi Grand Billionaire Making Scheme is a complete biological impossibility. The digital projection automatically zoomed in, magnifying the final paragraph of the old medical document until the black letters were larger than life. The wealthy crowd fell into a state of absolute dead silence as they read the brutal, undeniable medical conclusion. Patient name: Julian Dubois. Surgical outcome: complete bilateral testicular failure. Current fertility rate 0%. The stark white light from the massive digital projection washed over the incredibly silent ballroom, casting long, dramatic shadows across the terrified faces of the Atlanta elite. Prominent politicians, wealthy real estate tycoons, and high society socialites stood completely frozen, staring up at the glowing medical diagnosis that had just irrevocably destroyed the proud Dubois legacy. The absolute silence was so profoundly heavy that the subtle rustling of expensive silk gowns and the quiet clinking of ice in abandoned crystal glasses sounded like violent explosions. I stood perfectly still in the center of the room, my emerald dress shimmering brilliantly under the chandeliers, allowing the sheer magnitude of the truth to sink deep into their collective consciousness. Julian was no longer looking at the giant screen. He was staring directly at his own trembling hands as if they belonged to a complete stranger, unable to comprehend his reality. I walked gracefully across the polished marble floor and retrieved the heavy silver microphone that Vivian had dropped in her absolute panic. I held it firmly in my hand, my voice echoing with terrifying razor-sharp precision. Let us provide a little essential context to this fascinating piece of hidden family history, I announced, ensuring every single syllable sliced through the heavy tension. When Julian was exactly 14 years old, he suffered from a severe, highly complicated, and destructive medical emergency. It was an acute condition that required immediate aggressive surgical intervention to save his life. The top-tier pediatric surgeons at the private clinic successfully managed to stabilize him, but the irreversible physical damage was already entirely complete. I turned my cold, unwavering gaze directly toward the grand stage locking eyes with the crumbling, terrified matriarch. Vivienne Dubois, a woman who was pathologically obsessed with toxic male pride and the pristine aristocratic image of her precious bloodline, made a highly calculated decision that very day. Instead of helping her teenage son process a difficult life-altering medical reality, she chose to bury the truth completely. She aggressively paid off the private surgeons, ordered the complete destruction of the original physical records, and actively forced her own son to live inside a fragile, pathetic lie, just so she could maintain the flawless illusion of a dominant, untouchable male heir. She sacrificed her own son's sanity purely for social aesthetics. Julian looked physically ill. The arrogant, untouchable real estate heir, who had just brutally mocked my womanhood in a hospital room, was now staggering backward, completely stripped of his entire identity. He turned his head slowly, looking at his mother with wide, incredibly desperate eyes. He was silently begging her to call me a liar. He wanted her to take the microphone and announce to the wealthy crowd that this was just another elaborate, malicious prank. But Vivian could not look at him. She was actively shrinking away from his gaze, covering her face with her trembling hands, her elaborate high society facade completely destroyed by the undeniable digital proof glowing brightly behind her. She had spent decades building a flawless legacy, only to have it completely burned to ash in a matter of seconds. Naomi stepped forward, her voice shaking violently as she clutched the newborn babies against her chest. "This is a complete fabrication," Naomi shrieked desperately, trying to salvage her shattered billionaire fairy tale. "You hacked into a medical database and forged this document just to ruin my beautiful family. Julian is the father of these boys. He is a strong, perfectly healthy man. You are just a bitter, barren woman trying to steal my ultimate victory because you are deeply jealous of my fertility." I did not even blink at her pathetic, desperate outburst. I kept the heavy microphone raised, my voice cutting through her hysterical screams like sharp, freezing ice. "I am not barren, Naomi," I stated clearly, letting the heavy, undeniable words settle firmly over the completely stunned audience. "My reproductive health has always been perfectly flawless. There is absolutely nothing biologically wrong with my body. You really should have thoroughly researched his medical background before you carelessly plotted to trap him with another man-babies." I turned my complete, undivided attention back to Julian, watching his broad chest heave with rapid, suffocating breaths. I took a slow, deliberate step toward him, closing the physical distance. "We spent long years going to the most expensive fertility specialists in the state," I said, my tone shifting into something deeply personal and entirely unforgiving. "We sat in countless sterile waiting rooms. We paid for incredibly invasive procedures. And during our very first round of intensive in vitro fertilization, The lead specialist pulled me aside for a highly confidential, strictly private consultation. He showed me your updated biological metrics, Julian. He told me the absolute devastating truth about your actual physical condition, a secret your mother desperately buried. Julian's jaw dropped wide open. He stared at me, his dark eyes brimming with a sudden, overwhelming, devastating mixture of sheer horror and profound realization. The entire wealthy crowd leaned in much closer, utterly captivated by the raw, brutal unspooling of the elite high society marriage they had once admired. I leveled my unwavering gaze, fully ready to absolutely obliterate his massive manufactured ego once and for all. The toxic lie had to end permanently right now. You allowed your entire family to mock me. You allowed your sister to insult my womanhood. You allowed Connor to treat me like trash. And you brought your pathetic mistress to a hospital room to humiliate me over a biological limitation that belonged entirely to you. You are not a king, Julian. You are just a fragile, broken boy hiding behind your expensive lies. The absolute undeniable truth is finally exposed. You are completely sterile, Julian. 100%. I have known about this from the very beginning of our IVF journey, but because I truly loved you, I so willingly took the heavy burden of being labeled the barren wife entirely upon myself. Julian stood completely paralyzed for a long, agonizing moment as my words echoed through the cavernous ballroom. Then the paralysis shattered into pure, unadulterated rage. He whipped his head away from me and locked his furious, bloodshot eyes onto his mother. The polished, sophisticated real estate heir completely vanished, replaced by a broken, terrified man desperate for a lifeline. He marched across the stage, his heavy footsteps echoing loudly against the polished wood. "Tell me she is lying!" Julian roared, his voice tearing through the silent room like a jagged knife. "Tell them this is just another one of her psychotic crisis management tricks, Mother. Tell me right now." Vivienne physically recoiled from her son's aggressive advance. The terrifying, untouchable matriarch of the Dubois dynasty looked incredibly small and fragile under the blinding white light of the massive medical projection. She opened her mouth to speak, to deliver one of her signature commanding lies, but her voice completely failed her. Her perfectly manicured hands shook violently as she stared at the giant glowing words detailing her son's irreversible sterility. "Say something," Julian screamed, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. He grabbed the heavy brass microphone stand and violently hurled it across the stage. It crashed against the back wall, making several prominent politicians in the front row flinch and step back. "Look at me and tell me that my own mother did not let me believe my wife was broken just to protect a pathetic lie. Tell me I am the father of those boys." Vivienne could not maintain the pristine, aristocratic facade for a single second longer. Her knees suddenly gave out beneath her. The proud, fearsome woman, who had ruthlessly ruled Atlanta high society for over 3 decades, collapsed heavily onto the hard stage floor. The heavy silk of her designer gown pooled around her as she buried her face in her hands and began to weep. It was not a polite, restrained cry. It was a deep, guttural sobbing that completely stripped away her elegant persona, revealing the terrified, cowardly woman hiding underneath. "I am so sorry, Julian," she wailed, her voice distorted by heavy, gasping breaths. "I am so incredibly sorry. I just wanted to protect your future. I wanted to protect your absolute power in this unforgiving city." A collective, shocked gasp rippled rapidly through the incredibly wealthy crowd. The elite guests whispered frantically to one another, completely captivated by the brutal public destruction of the most powerful family in their exclusive social circle. The wealthy politicians who had just been shaking Julian's hand suddenly took several massive steps backward, wanting to completely distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of this unprecedented scandal. Waiters froze in place, holding their silver trays of champagne, absolutely terrified to make even a single sound. Beatrice clamped her hands over her ears, as if trying to physically block out her mother's devastating confession. Connor stood frozen nearby, his pale face dripping with nervous sweat, completely unsure of how to navigate this spectacular disaster. Julian stumbled backward, his breathing shallow and erratic. He clutched his chest, looking as if his heart had been physically ripped out of his ribcage. You knew, he choked out, his voice barely a raw whisper. You knew I was sterile my entire life, and you let me torture Chloe over it. You let me divorce the only woman who actually protected me. Vivienne raised her tear-stained face, her perfect makeup now completely ruined. I was absolutely terrified, she sobbed, clutching the fabric of her expensive dress. When you were 14, the surgeons told me the damage was completely irreversible. But the board of directors was already circling like vultures, waiting for a sign of weakness in our bloodline. If they knew the primary heir was permanently sterile, they would have ruthlessly dismantled your grandfather's legacy. I had to bury the medical files. I had to pay off the clinic staff to ensure your position remained utterly untouchable. Julian shook his head violently, refusing to accept the sheer magnitude of her betrayal. You destroyed my life for a corporate board seat. I did it for you, Vivienne cried, reaching out a trembling hand toward him. I wanted you to feel like a complete man. I wanted you to walk into every boardroom with absolute supreme confidence. But the burden was suffocating Julian. Do you have any idea the pure, unadulterated terror I experienced the exact moment Naomi walked into our estate and proudly announced she was carrying your biological children? The entire ballroom held its breath. Naomi clutched the newborn twins tighter, her eyes darting wildly around the room looking for a viable escape route. I knew it was a complete biological impossibility, Vivienne continued, her voice rising in a desperate, hysterical pitch. I knew you could never father a child, but I was entirely trapped inside my own elaborate deception. If I exposed Naomi lies, I would have to publicly expose your highly confidential medical condition to the ruthless board of directors, thereby risking the complete hostile takeover of our generational wealth by aggressive outside corporate investors. If I told you the truth, I would lose you forever. So I stayed silent. I watched you celebrate another man-children because I was too much of a coward to admit what I had done to you. I lived in absolute, terrifying agony every single day, watching this horrible disaster unfold. The heavy, crushing reality of his mother confession finally settled over Julian. The horrific weight of the truth completely crushed the last remaining fragments of his massive ego. He had brutally discarded a brilliant, fiercely loyal wife who had silently protected his deepest insecurity from the vicious judgment of his peers. He had proudly flaunted his deceitful mistress in front of the entire city, throwing lavish celebrations to flaunt his supposed virility. He had arrogantly signed away his vast fortune and his beautiful estate, believing he had secured his ultimate victory and cemented his permanent place at the very top of the social hierarchy. And it was all built on a spectacularly hollow lie. I stood perfectly still, letting the magnificent, beautiful chaos I had personally orchestrated wash completely over the massive, crowded room full of extremely wealthy elites. I watched the mental gears turning frantically inside Julian's head. He slowly processed his mother's hysterical admission. He mentally calculated the undeniable medical facts glowing brightly on the giant screen behind her. He pieced together the absolute biological certainty of his condition. If his reproductive capability was truly 0%, if it was physically impossible for him to ever conceive a single child, Julian's entire physical body went rigidly stiff. The devastating sorrow in his eyes instantly hardened into something intensely dark and incredibly dangerous. He slowly turned his heavy head away from his weeping mother, entirely disgusted by her presence. He locked his bloodshot, murderous gaze directly onto the terrified woman standing just a few feet away, wearing the stolen diamond necklace that belonged to his ancestors. Julian stared blankly at Naomi. He stared intently at the two newborn boys, wrapped tightly in their pristine white hospital blankets, sleeping soundly, while the entire empire burned to the ground around them. The terrible, absolute realization washed over him completely, erasing any remaining affection he had for the woman who had effortlessly manipulated his desperate desire for a family. If I cannot have children, Julian said, his voice dropping into a low, terrifyingly calm register that sent a violent shiver through the entire ballroom. Then whose babies are you holding right now, Naomi? Who exactly did you sleep with to create this disgusting scheme? Julian stepped deliberately toward Naomi. His fists were clenched so tightly at his sides that his knuckles were stark white. The air in the opulent ballroom felt dangerously thin, as if all the oxygen had been completely sucked out of the room. I asked you a direct question, Naomi, Julian growled. His voice trembled with a terrifying blend of absolute heartbreak and pure, unadulterated rage. If my mother is telling the truth and I am completely sterile, who exactly is the biological father of those children you are holding? Naomi stumbled backward in pure panic. The hem of her gaudy crimson dress tangled awkwardly around her high heels. She clutched the newborn twins so aggressively against her chest that one of the baby boys began to cry. The thin, piercing wail echoed loudly through the dead silence of the country club, but nobody moved to comfort her. Julian. Please, Naomi stammered, shaking her head frantically from side to side. You cannot possibly listen to her. Maya is blatantly lying. She paid a hacker to fabricate that medical document just to ruin us. I swear to you on my life, I only ever slept with you. These are your precious sons. They are the true Du Bois heirs. Julian let out a harsh, barking laugh that held absolutely zero humor. He pointed a shaking finger at the giant glowing screen behind them. My own mother just collapsed on this stage and confessed to hiding my medical records for over 2 decades, Naomi. She admitted she paid off surgeons to cover up my condition. Are you genuinely going to stand here in front of half the city and tell me that you magically cured my permanent sterility in a downtown hotel room? Naomi looked wildly around the massive ballroom. Her dark eyes were wide with sheer desperation. She looked at the wealthy investors, the powerful politicians, and the elite socialites she had been trying to impress just 10 minutes ago. She was frantically searching the crowd for a single sympathetic face, but she found only cold, harshly judgmental stares. The Atlanta elite were watching her drown in her own toxic lies, and not a single person was going to throw her a life preserver. She tried to approach Vivian, who was still weeping heavily on the floor. Vivian, tell him, Naomi begged, her voice cracking with hysteria. Tell him these are his boys. You held them in the hospital. You said you saw the strong family resemblance. You have to defend your grandsons. I watched Naomi aggressively thrash inside the invisible, inescapable net I had so carefully woven around her. It was a thoroughly pathetic display, but I was absolutely not going to let her wriggle her way out of this trap. I raised the heavy silver microphone back to my lips, commanding the room once again. Save your breath, Naomi, I instructed smoothly, my voice projecting clearly over the sound of the crying infant. Vivian cannot save you anymore. Her entire credibility burned to ash the exact second that medical screen lit up. And quite frankly, watching you desperately try to gaslight a man who just discovered his entire existence is a biological lie is getting incredibly tedious. I took 2 slow, highly measured steps toward the center of the polished stage. The heavy emerald silk of my designer gown brushed softly against the floor. I held up the small silver remote control once again. The collective gaze of the entire wealthy ballroom shifted instantly from Naomi's terrified face directly back to my raised hand. They knew exactly what this simple gesture meant. I was about to drop another devastating bomb directly onto the smoldering ruins of the Du Bois dynasty. You see? I announced to the captivated crowd, keeping my tone perfectly conversational and lethal. When you hire a premier crisis management firm to handle your darkest corporate secrets, you are paying for extreme thoroughness. I do not deal in vague assumptions. I do not rely on partial truths. I rely exclusively on absolute undeniable data. When I discovered the massive offshore money laundering operation, funneled straight through Naomi high-end art gallery, I started tracking every single person associated with her private accounts. I tracked her secure communications. I tracked her hidden travel logs. And most importantly, I legally acquired a very specific genetic sample for a highly confidential laboratory test. Naomi's eyes widened in pure unadulterated horror. She knew exactly what was coming. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. No, she gasped, taking another panicked step backward until she hit the edge of a decorated dining table. Maya, do not do this. Please. I smiled warmly at the woman who had once been my best friend. You wanted the spotlight, Naomi. You demanded to be the absolute center of attention at the biggest high society gala of the year. You wore their family diamonds and mocked my womanhood. I am simply giving you exactly what you asked for. Total, unfiltered exposure. I pressed the single silver button on the remote control. The giant LED screen behind the weeping matriarch flickered instantly. The 22-year-old surgical record vanished, replaced in a split second by a brand new, sharply glowing document. It was a pristine, highly certified laboratory report from one of the most prestigious genetic testing facilities in the entire country. The bold black letters stood out starkly against the bright white background. A chorus of loud, deeply shocked gasps erupted from the elite audience. People actually covered their mouths in horror. Their eyes darted rapidly from the giant screen to the people standing near the stage. The level of sheer, depraved betrayal displayed on that glowing digital board was almost entirely incomprehensible. I did not let the heavy silence linger for more than a second. I lifted the microphone and read the devastating conclusion loud and clear, ensuring my voice reached the heavy brass doors at the very back of the opulent ballroom. Official DNA paternity test results. I announced, heavily savoring the incredible weight of every single word. Probability of biological relationship, 99.99%. I lowered the microphone slightly. I turned my head and locked my cold, predatory eyes directly onto the pale, sweating face of the man standing completely frozen near the open bar. Biological father, Connor Kensington. The name Connor Kensington hung in the heavy, suffocating air of the opulent ballroom. For a split second, absolute silence reigned, the kind of deep, terrified quiet that precedes a catastrophic natural disaster. Then the entire room erupted into pure, unfiltered chaos. Prominent politicians, wealthy real estate developers, and the most elite socialites in Atlanta actually shoved each other to step away from the epicenter of the scandal. Beatrice let out a sound that I could only describe as a dying animal. The polished, arrogant socialite dropped her expensive crystal clutch, the glass shattering against the marble floor, completely forgotten. She slowly turned her head to look at her husband, her face twisted into a mask of sheer, unadulterated horror. Connor stood completely frozen, the commanding posture he had maintained all evening totally collapsing. He stared up at the giant digital screen, his jaw hanging open, his pale face dripping with sudden, terrified sweat. He looked wildly around the room, frantically searching for an escape route that simply did not exist. Connor. Beatrice whispered, her voice trembling so violently it barely sounded human. Tell me this is a sick joke. Tell me you did not sleep with my brother, mistress. Tell me you are not the father of those babies. Connor opened his mouth, but absolutely no words came out. He backed away from his wife, his expensive leather shoes squeaking against the polished floor. Naomi shrank back against the stage, clutching the crying twins tighter, her eyes darting between Julian and Connor in absolute panic. Beatrice let out another agonizing, guttural scream. She lunged forward, her manicured hands curled into fists, and began violently striking Connor's chest. "You disgusting, treacherous monster!" She shrieked, tears of absolute humiliation streaming down her face, completely ruining her flawless makeup. "You stood in my house, you slept in my bed, and you planned this entire disgusting scheme with that pathetic social climbing gallery owner." Julian stood nearby, looking physically nauseated as the horrific reality washed over him. The twin boys he had proudly claimed as the ultimate Dubois heirs just moments ago were actually his sister-husband biological children. I kept the heavy silver microphone raised, cutting through the chaotic shouting with absolute terrifying clarity. "Allow me to illuminate the sheer, calculated brilliance of your husband, disgusting betrayal, Beatrice," I announced smoothly, ensuring my voice commanded the entire frantic ballroom. Connor Hedge Fund was completely empty. He had ruthlessly stolen his client's money to buy a secret downtown penthouse. But a $30 million penthouse is absolute pocket change compared to the legendary Du Bois Generational Trust Fund. Connor was a desperately greedy outsider. He married into this prominent African-American family purely for financial leverage, but he quickly realized the brutal truth. The trust fund is strictly locked by blood. As a mere son-in-law, Connor would never be granted the master keys to the primary billion-dollar accounts. He needed a direct, controllable pipeline into the core of your empire. I took a slow, deliberate step toward Connor, thoroughly enjoying his utter devastation. He knew Julian was desperately looking for a way to secure an heir. He knew Naomi was a greedy, willing pawn, eager to elevate her social status. So Connor engineered the perfect, disgusting trap. He slept with Naomi, created his own biological children, and handed them directly to Julian. He planned to use his own secret biological sons as Trojan horses to eventually seize total control of the entire Du Bois fortune. He used your own massive toxic family ego against you, allowing you to proudly adopt the parasites that would eventually bleed your empire dry. You welcomed the enemy right through the front door because you were entirely blinded by your own arrogance and your desperate need to appear superior to a woman who actually built her own wealth. Connor backed into a heavy banquet table, knocking over a towering centerpiece of white roses. The water spilled everywhere, soaking the bottom of his custom-tailored tuxedo pants. The sheer, overwhelming reality of his complete financial and social destruction finally snapped the last remaining threads of his carefully constructed sanity. The polished, refined investment banker persona completely vanished instantly, replaced by the vicious, deeply arrogant racist he had always been hiding underneath. Connor let out a loud, harsh, incredibly ugly laugh that silenced the screaming and crying around him. He aggressively shoved Beatrice away, sending her stumbling backward into the crowd. She collided with a passing waiter, sending a silver tray of champagne glasses crashing to the floor in a shower of expensive crystal and spilled wine. "Oh, spare me your pathetic, dramatic outrage." Connor spat, his face twisting into a furious, mocking sneer. He glared at Beatrice, Julian, and Vivian with absolute, unfiltered disgust, stripping away every ounce of respect he had faked for years. "You people walk around this city acting like you are untouchable royalty, constantly bragging about your precious black excellence and your elite generational wealth. But underneath all these expensive suits and fancy ballrooms, you are all just incredibly gullible, deeply insecure fools. It was painfully easy to manipulate every single one of you." Julian was so incredibly desperate to prove he was a real, functioning man that he did not even bother to question the sudden, miraculous pregnancy from his opportunistic mistress. Vivian was so completely terrified of losing her prestigious high society crown that she willingly buried her own son's actual medical records just to keep up appearances. Connor laughed again, pacing aggressively like a trapped rabid animal. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at the gasping crowd of prominent African-American politicians and wealthy investors. "I did not ruin your precious family. I just used your own pathetic, arrogant stupidity to take what I actually deserved. You desperately needed my brilliant white financial mind to manage your messy, chaotic empire, and I was going to use those twin boys to rightfully claim every single dime of it. You were all so deeply obsessed with maintaining your flawless aristocratic image that you handed over the keys to your entire kingdom to the only person in this room smart enough to outplay you. You let me walk right in and take everything because you are entirely incapable of managing your own legacy without relying on outsiders to clean up your endless mistakes." Connor's arrogant declaration hung in the air for exactly 1 second before the fragile dam holding back the Du Bois family completely shattered. The polished veneer of generations of high society conditioning dissolved into pure primal violence. Beatrice was the first to snap. The realization that her own husband had used her simply as a financial stepping stone while sleeping with her brother. Mistress completely broke her mind. She let out a deafening raw scream that tore through her throat and lunged directly at Connor. Beatrice did not slap him like a refined socialite. She threw her entire body weight against his chest, her hands curling into vicious claws. She raked her manicured nails deeply across his face, drawing instant bright red tracks of blood down his pale cheek. Connor stumbled backward, crying out in sudden pain, trying to grab her wrist to stop the brutal assault. "You racist, treacherous animal!" Beatrice shrieked at the absolute top of her lungs. "You used me to steal my family money. You ruined my entire life." She kicked him aggressively in the shins, tearing the lapels of his custom-tailored tuxedo right off his chest. But Beatrice's fury was absolutely nothing compared to the catastrophic rage exploding inside Julian. Julian had just lost his fortune, his wife, his massive ego, and his biological legacy all in the span of 20 minutes. And the man responsible for the final, most humiliating blow was standing right in front of him, laughing at his profound stupidity. Julian let out a dark, guttural roar that sounded entirely inhuman. He charged across the marble floor like a runaway freight train. He did not hesitate. He tackled Connor with such devastating explosive force that both men flew backward, crashing violently onto a table overflowing with crystal champagne flutes. The heavy table completely collapsed under their combined weight. Thousands of sharp glass shards rained down around them, mixing with the spilled, expensive wine. Julian scrambled to mount Connor, pinning his shoulders against the wet marble floor. Julian raised his heavy fist and drove it directly into Connor's arrogant face. The sickening crack of breaking bone echoed sharply across the terrified ballroom. Julian hit him again, and again. "You think you are smarter than us?" Julian roared, blood flying from his bruised knuckles. "You think you can steal my life and laugh at me in my own building?" Connor desperately tried to fight back, throwing a wild, desperate punch that caught Julian squarely on the jaw. Julian's head snapped to the side, his lips splitting open, dark blood instantly pouring down his chin and staining his crisp white shirt. But the physical pain only fueled Julian's violent, uncontrollable rage. He grabbed Connor by his expensive silk collar and slammed his head back against the hard floor. The two men rolled through the broken glass and crushed white roses, completely destroying each other in a vicious, bloody brawl that horrified every single prominent investor watching from the sidelines. While the two men tore each other apart in the center of the room, Naomi saw her only window of opportunity to escape total destruction. She knew the federal police were standing just outside the main doors. She knew her art gallery was already seized. She frantically adjusted her grip on the screaming twin boys and began edging desperately toward the heavy velvet curtains covering the rear kitchen service exit. She kept her head down, hoping the extreme violence consuming the Du Bois family would provide enough distraction for her to slip out into the dark Atlanta night and disappear completely. She severely underestimated the terrifying wrath of a ruined matriarch. Vivienne Dubois had just lost her entire aristocratic empire. Her deepest, darkest medical secret had been broadcast to the entire city. Her son was brawling like a street thug in front of her most important peers. And the opportunistic woman who had acted as the catalyst for this catastrophic nightmare was trying to sneak out the back door wearing the sacred Dubois family diamonds. Vivienne pushed herself up from the stage floor. She kicked off her crippling designer heels and sprinted across the ballroom with a terrifying predator speed. Naomi was just inches away from the heavy kitchen doors when Vivienne violently intercepted her. Vivienne did not speak. She did not politely ask for the necklace back. She lunged forward and aggressively grabbed a massive fistful of Naomi's long, carefully styled hair. Naomi shrieked in absolute agony, her head snapping backward as Vivienne violently yanked her down to the floor. The stolen diamond necklace dug sharply into Naomi's neck. "You pathetic, thieving parasite!" Vivienne screamed, her voice cracking with pure aristocratic fury. "You are not walking out of my club with my family jewels. You are nothing but common street trash." Vivienne yanked the heavy diamond necklace so forcefully that the gold clasp completely snapped. The priceless heirloom dug a harsh red line across Naomi's skin before coming free in Vivienne's shaking hands. Naomi sobbed hysterically, trying to protect the crying babies from the violent scuffle while simultaneously scrambling to get away from the furious matriarch. The absolute elite of Atlanta high society watched the wealthiest family in the state completely cannibalize one another on the ballroom floor. Prominent politicians physically turned their backs and rushed for the exit, terrified of being photographed anywhere near the bloody, screaming chaos. The pristine, untouchable Du Bois legacy was officially dead, entirely slaughtered by their own toxic greed and massive arrogance. I stood near the edge of the grand stage, watching the magnificent, chaotic destruction unfold with absolute, unbothered serenity. The emerald silk of my gown remained perfectly spotless. Julian suddenly stopped punching Connor. He was panting heavily, his chest heaving as he knelt in the spilled champagne and broken glass. His face was covered in dark blood, his custom suit completely shredded. He slowly turned his head and looked up at me. He looked at the calm, terrifying power radiating from my posture. He realized in that exact desperate second that I was the only person in the entire universe who possessed the strategic capability to fix a crisis of this colossal magnitude. I had saved him from federal prison 5 years ago. He genuinely believed I could somehow save him again. Julian pushed himself off of Connor's unconscious body. He stumbled blindly across the ruined ballroom, his bloody shoes slipping on the wet marble. He staggered directly toward me, tears of absolute desperation streaming down his bruised, bleeding face. He dropped heavily to his knees right in front of me. He reached out with his shaking, blood-stained hands and tightly wrapped his arms around my legs, burying his face against the silk fabric of my dress. "Chloe, please." Julian sobbed, his voice breaking into a pathetic, agonizing wail as he squeezed my legs tighter. "I am so sorry. I was completely wrong about everything. Please forgive me. You are the only one who knows how to fix this. Please, I am begging you on my hands and knees. Please save me and clean up this mess." I looked down at the pathetic, bleeding man groveling on the floor. Julian, tears soaked directly into the pristine emerald silk of my designer gown. The wealthy, powerful heir to the Dubois real estate dynasty was weeping like a terrified child, desperately clinging to the very same woman he had viciously discarded in a hospital room just a few days ago. The invisible camera of my mind zoomed in perfectly on this exact defining moment. I kept my face absolutely cold, an impenetrable mask of pure, flawless serenity. I did not reach down to comfort him. I did not offer a single ounce of warmth or sympathy. I slowly and deliberately took a firm step backward. I ruthlessly yanked the expensive fabric of my dress entirely out of his weak, blood-stained grasp. Julian slumped forward onto the cold marble floor, his empty hands grasping at thin air. He looked up at me with wide, completely shattered eyes, still foolishly hoping for a miracle that was never going to arrive. I stared back at him with absolute terrifying authority. "I am a premier crisis management expert, Julian," I stated, enunciating every single word so they struck him like physical blows. "My entire professional career is strictly dedicated to fixing catastrophic disasters for the elite. I have spent the last 5 years quietly erasing your mistakes, hiding your massive financial blunders, and protecting your fragile ego from the harsh reality of the business world. But what is happening in this ballroom tonight is absolutely not a crisis." I paused, letting the heavy, suffocating silence of the opulent room amplify my final verdict. "The absolute spectacular destruction of your toxic family is the most perfect, brilliant masterpiece I have ever created. I spent weeks meticulously calculating every single move, predicting every arrogant mistake you and your mother would make. I set the stage and you all happily walked right into the fire because your monumental greed completely blinded you." I looked directly into his terrified soul. "I do not clean up my own masterpieces, Julian. I simply stand back, fold my hands together in absolute silence, and watch them beautifully burn directly to the ground right before my very eyes." Julian let out a hollow, agonizing gasp. The last tiny flicker of hope completely died in his dark eyes. He finally understood the sheer magnitude of his fatal error. He had not just lost a loyal wife. He had aggressively banished the only powerful architect who knew how to keep his crumbling castle standing. He buried his bruised, bleeding face in his hands, his broad shoulders shaking violently as he wept into the spilled champagne, and broken crystal scattered across the floor. I turned my gaze away from his pathetic display, and looked toward the heavy brass doors at the entrance of the grand ballroom. I raised my right hand and gave a sharp, deliberate nod. The tactical squad of Federal Economic Police agents who had been standing by silently observing the entire violent family implosion immediately sprang into coordinated action. But they did not step forward to arrest Julian. They marched straight past his sobbing figure on the floor, moving with terrifying speed, directly toward the chaotic corner where Connor and Naomi were still trying to recover from the brutal physical brawl. The wealthy crowd parted instantly, terrified of being caught in the crossfire. Connor was leaning heavily against a shattered banquet table, pressing a cocktail napkin against his bleeding, broken nose. When he saw the federal agents marching aggressively in his direction, his remaining arrogance instantly morphed into sheer, unadulterated panic. He tried to stand up straight, desperately attempting to summon his usual white privilege and corporate swagger, but his legs were shaking too violently. "Wait!" Connor stammered, holding up his hands defensively as the lead agent closed the distance. "You do not understand the situation. I am a managing director at Kensington Capital Partners. I have top-tier Wall Street lawyers on speed dial. You cannot simply approach me without formal legal representation." The lead federal agent did not hesitate for a single second. He grabbed Connor forcefully by the shoulder and spun him around violently, slamming him face first against the nearest marble pillar. Connor let out a loud, pathetic yelp of pain as his broken nose hit the cold stone. Connor Kensington, the agent, boomed, pulling a pair of heavy steel handcuffs from his tactical belt. "You are officially under federal arrest for massive corporate fraud, grand larceny, and running an illegal multi-million-dollar money laundering syndicate." The agent aggressively wrenched Connor's arms behind his back, the metal cuffs clicking shut with a loud, terrifying finality. "You have the right to remain silent, but I highly suggest you use it because we already possess every single piece of financial evidence we need to lock you away for decades," the agent concluded. Naomi watched her secret lover and criminal accomplice get brutally restrained. She let out a shrill, terrified shriek. She was still sitting on the floor where Vivian had violently ripped the diamond necklace from her throat. The stolen twin babies were crying loudly beside her, completely ignored, in her desperate panic to save herself. Naomi tried to scramble backward, her expensive crimson dress slipping on the wet floor, but two female federal agents immediately flanked her. They grabbed her arms and hauled her forcefully to her feet. "Get your hands off me!" Naomi screamed hysterically, thrashing wildly against their iron grip. "I am a highly respected high society gallery owner. I am completely and entirely innocent. He made me do it. Connor forced me to process the dirty money through my art sales. It was all his disgusting idea." The agents ignored her frantic, pathetic lies. They swiftly locked heavy steel handcuffs tightly around her wrists. Naomi Pierce, one of the agents, stated coldly, "You are officially under federal arrest for conspiracy to commit massive federal wire fraud and aggressive financial laundering today in this city." The heavy steel handcuffs clicked shut around Naomi's wrists with a sharp metallic finality that echoed across the silent ballroom. Two female federal agents aggressively hauled her toward the grand brass exit doors. Naomi fought wildly against their iron grip, her expensive crimson gown tearing at the seams as her high heels slipped on the champagne-soaked marble floor. She twisted her head backward, screaming hysterically for Julian to save her, but her desperate pleas fell on completely deaf ears. Julian did not even look in her direction. He just stared blankly at the two crying newborn boys, resting in their carriers, suddenly realizing they were nothing but living, breathing monuments to his ultimate humiliation. On the other side of the ruined banquet table, Connor was faring much worse. The lead federal agent shoved him forcefully toward the exit. Connor's broken nose was bleeding heavily down his chin, completely ruining his custom-tailored tuxedo shirt. He tried to shout threats about his powerful white shoe lawyers and his untouchable Wall Street connections, but the words were muffled by the blood pooling in his mouth. The elite African-American politicians and wealthy real estate developers who had eagerly shaken his hand just an hour ago now turned their backs on him in utter disgust. Nobody stepped forward to defend the arrogant outsider who had just been exposed as a ruthless, thieving parasite. They watched with grim satisfaction as the federal agents marched Connor and Naomi out of the country club, entirely stripping them of their manufactured dignity. The sheer catastrophic reality of the situation finally broke the terrifying matriarch of the Du Bois dynasty. Vivian had spent her entire existence ruthlessly curating an image of absolute aristocratic perfection. She had sacrificed her own son's sanity and happiness just to maintain a flawless facade. Now she was forced to watch her prominent family burn to the ground on live public display. Her legacy was completely annihilated. Her offshore accounts were frozen, her son was publicly exposed as permanently sterile, and her daughter-husband was a federal criminal being dragged away in handcuffs. Vivian clutched her chest, gasping loudly for air that suddenly refused to fill her lungs. Her eyes rolled back into her head, and the remaining color drained entirely from her face. The proud, terrifying woman collapsed heavily onto the grand stage, hitting the wooden floorboards with a dull, sickening thud. Beatrice screamed in pure terror, abandoning the broken remains of her own marriage to rush to her mother's side. Someone in the wealthy crowd frantically yelled for a doctor, while the country club management desperately called for an emergency ambulance. The distant wail of approaching sirens began to pierce the cool Atlanta night air, signaling the absolute medical and social death of the Du Bois matriarch. Amidst the spectacular, deafening chaos, Julian remained kneeling on the cold, wet marble floor. He looked absolutely hollowed out, a pathetic, empty shell of the arrogant billionaire who had once believed he ruled the city. He slowly turned his bruised, bleeding face toward the crying twin boys. The infants he had proudly paraded around the hospital room, the sons he had brutally used to mock my perceived infertility. He stared at their tiny faces and finally saw the horrifying, undeniable truth. He saw Connor features reflected in their eyes. He realized he had willingly destroyed his brilliant, fiercely loyal wife just to proudly adopt the ultimate instrument of his own financial destruction. He had absolutely nothing left. No wife, no fortune, no legacy, no honor. He was a complete ghost trapped inside a ruined body, staring at the total evaporation of his aristocratic privilege. His entire bloodline ended right here in a puddle of cheap champagne and shattered glass. I stood towering above him, looking down at the spectacular wreckage I had flawlessly engineered. The crisis management expert inside me deeply appreciated the sheer clean efficiency of this total demolition. I reached down to my left hand. I slowly gripped the massive custom-designed diamond wedding ring that Julian had placed on my finger 7 years ago. The heavy platinum band suddenly felt like a toxic burning chain. I pulled it off my finger with smooth, deliberate precision. I held the flawless diamond suspended in the air right above Julian's bowed head. He looked up at me, his dark eyes silently begging for a microscopic shred of mercy that he absolutely did not deserve. I opened my hand. The heavy diamond ring dropped through the air. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, loud clatter that somehow managed to cut clearly through the chaotic screaming and the blaring ambulance sirens. The ring bounced once, hitting a broken piece of crystal before rolling directly into a dark puddle of spilled red wine. It was the absolute perfect punctuation mark to the end of his entire existence. I did not say a single parting word. I simply turned my back on the pathetic kneeling man and began my slow, elegant walk toward the grand exit. The crowd of wealthy, powerful elites instantly parted for me. They cleared a wide, respectful path, pressing their bodies against the decorated walls to ensure they did not accidentally brush against my emerald silk gown. They looked at me with a profound mixture of absolute reverence and deep, terrifying fear. They knew exactly who truly ran this city now. I walked straight out the heavy brass doors of the Onyx Club, leaving the suffocating, toxic atmosphere of the Du Bois family completely behind me. I stepped out into the cool, refreshing evening air. The flashing red and blue lights of the arriving ambulances and federal police cruisers painted the towering columns of the country club. I kept my posture impeccably straight and my chin held high. I did not turn my head. I did not pause my stride. I absolutely did not look back at the magnificent, beautiful fire I had just flawlessly ignited. The night sky above the affluent Buckhead neighborhood felt incredibly expansive and remarkably clear. For the very first time in my entire adult life, I was breathing air that did not taste like someone else's lies. The chaotic symphony of blaring ambulance sirens and flashing police lights faded seamlessly into the warm, golden ambiance of my private penthouse. The transition from the spectacular, bloody destruction of the Onyx Club to the absolute pristine sanctuary of my own living room felt incredibly surreal. I stood near the massive floor-to-ceiling windows, looking out over the glittering Atlanta skyline. I had completely shed the heavy emerald silk gown, replacing it with a simple, luxurious cashmere robe. I poured myself a generous glass of a rare vintage red wine, the deep ruby liquid swirling smoothly against the delicate crystal glass. I walked slowly over to my plush velvet armchair and sat down, crossing my legs with profound comfort. I took a slow, deeply satisfying sip of the rich wine. I looked directly forward, breaking the invisible barrier between us, and smiled warmly at you. They genuinely believed they could strip me of absolutely everything just because I did not possess their prestigious aristocratic pedigree, I said, my voice echoing softly in the quiet, expansive room. They looked at my self-made success and saw nothing but a temporary, highly disposable commoner who was lucky to simply breathe their rarefied air. But they completely forgot one absolutely crucial detail. Venomous snakes are not born resting on imported silk sheets. They are bred in the harshest, most unforgiving thickets. I leaned back against the soft velvet, letting the sheer, unadulterated weight of my total victory settle deep into my bones. The elite African-American society of Atlanta had spent decades worshiping the flawless, untouchable illusion of the Du Bois family legacy. They had bowed down to Vivian, terrifying aristocratic demands, and blindly trusted Connor, aggressive Wall Street swagger. They had eagerly celebrated Julian manufactured superiority. But illusions are ultimately fragile. They shatter the exact second you introduce a heavy dose of undeniable, brutal reality. The immediate aftermath of the gala was a masterful, highly efficient bloodbath. Connor Kensington and Naomi Pierce were currently sitting in separate cold federal holding cells in downtown Atlanta. The federal judge overseeing their high-profile financial case had decisively denied them bail, citing them as severe flight risks given their extensive offshore money laundering syndicate. Naomi was facing up to 20 years in a federal penitentiary for massive corporate fraud, entirely stripped of the glamorous high society life she had sold her soul to achieve. The stolen twin babies had been placed temporarily in the care of state protective services until the court could untangle the horrific, complicated web of their true paternity. Vivienne Dubois never returned to her sprawling historical estate in Buckhead. Following her severe stress-induced collapse on the ballroom stage, she was transported to a remarkably average, incredibly sterile public medical facility. The freezing of her massive offshore accounts meant her premium health insurance policies had instantly bounced. The proud, terrifying matriarch was now recovering in a shared hospital room, entirely abandoned by the wealthy socialites who used to hang on her every single word. Her prestigious country club memberships were permanently revoked. Her legendary social standing was completely annihilated. She was finally forced to exist in the exact same ordinary world she had spent her entire life aggressively looking down upon. And Julian, my arrogant, deeply cruel ex-husband, had lost absolutely everything he valued in a single devastating night. With his inherited wealth legally seized by my holding company to cover his massive defaulted debts, Julian was forced to rapidly vacate the luxury mansion. The man who had viciously mocked my supposed infertility and proudly paraded another man, children in my face, was currently residing in a cheap, incredibly run-down motel on the outskirts of the city. He had no empire. He had no legacy. He had no biological future. His massive, fragile ego had been shattered into a million unrecoverable pieces, and there was absolutely no amount of crisis management that could ever glue him back together. I took another slow, appreciative sip of my wine. The absolute silence of my penthouse was suddenly interrupted by the sharp, crisp ringing of my private, highly encrypted business phone resting on the marble coffee table. I glanced at the glowing screen. The caller identification displayed a restricted, highly exclusive New York area code. I already knew exactly who was calling. I reached out and answered the call, bringing the phone to my ear without a single ounce of hesitation. Maya Caldwell, a deep, incredibly authoritative voice rumbled through the speaker. I am Richard Sterling, managing director of the largest international corporate communications conglomerate on Wall Street. I spent my entire evening watching the spectacular, highly calculated implosion of the Du Bois real estate empire on the financial news networks. I smiled, tracing the rim of my crystal wine glass. Good evening, Richard. I assume you are not calling to ask for real estate advice. Richard let out a low, deeply impressed chuckle. Absolutely not. I am calling because any crisis management expert who can legally dismantle a billion-dollar dynasty in under 24 hours without breaking a single federal law is someone I desperately need on my side. I do not want to compete with you, Maya. I want to hire you. I am offering you the position of Global Chief Executive Officer for my entire international firm. You name your exact salary. You name your absolute terms. I will sign the contract blindly. I stood up slowly from the velvet chair. I walked back over to the massive glass windows, looking out at the sprawling, glittering city of Atlanta, stretching endlessly into the dark night. I had conquered this city. I had burned down the toxic castles of the people who tried to destroy me, and I had built my own impenetrable fortress directly on top of their ashes. The world was entirely mine for the taking. I will have my personal legal team forward you my newly updated, highly aggressive contract terms by tomorrow morning, Richard. I replied, my voice radiating pure, untouchable authority. Prepare your board of directors for a massive structural shift. The rules of engagement are about to change globally. I ended the call with a swift, decisive tap of my finger. I set the phone down on the polished marble sill. I raised my crystal wine glass directly toward the invisible camera, locking my confident, victorious eyes with yours. A cool, knowing smile spread flawlessly across my face as I embraced the magnificent, hard-earned power flowing through my veins. Cheers to new beginnings.